Welcome to the Sports Governance Podcast, the place where we dig into the systems, decisions, and power structures that shape sports all around the world. Over the past episodes, we have explored how global sport is governed, how rules are enforced, and how accountability often remains uneven. We have seen that governance in sport is rarely just about formal structures. It's about power, about who has the authority to decide, and more importantly, who can actually be held accountable. We have also examined the growing tension between autonomy and accountability. On one hand, sport institutions claim independence from political interference. On the other, moments of crisis, whether related to athlete protection, geopolitical conflicts, or human rights, reveal the limits of that autonomy and the absence of effective external oversight. But if there is one actor that consistently appears at the margins of these discussions, it is the European Union. Unlike international federations, the EU doesn't govern sport directly. And yet, through law, competition policy, and court decisions, it has increasingly shaped the boundaries within which sport operates. As recent cases have shown, when sport governance fails to regulate itself, particularly in situations of monopoly, power, or lack of transparency, external legal intervention becomes not only possible but decisive. This 11th episode raises a broader question. What role can and should the EU play in shaping governance in international sport? Is it a regulator of last resort, stepping in only when self-regulation breaks down? Or is it becoming a central actor in redefining the balance between autonomy, accountability, and market regulation in sports? And beyond Europe, another dynamic is unfolding. As sport continues to globalize with new actors, new markets, and growing geopolitical stakes, the relative influence of the EU may itself be challenged. If governance in sports is increasingly shaped outside of Europe, what does that mean for the EU's ability to act as a normative or regulatory power in the future? To explore these questions, I'm joined today by Arnout Geracht, whose work sits precisely at the intersection of sport, governance, EU policy, and regulatory frameworks. Let's break it down. Thank you, Arnout, for joining us today. Before we dive into the core of the topic, I would like to start with your own journey. You've been working at the intersection of EU policy, academia, and sports governance for many years. What initially drew you to this field, and how has your perspective on sports governance evolved through your research and practical work?
When it was time to write my master thesis at the KU Leuven in international politics, there was kind of a master thesis fair. So all the supervisors or the potential supervisors, they came to present their topics. And I was just listening to all these topics, and all of a sudden there was one professor who said, if you come and do a master thesis with me, you can work around environmental governance, global environmental governance. And then at the end of it, his presentation, he said, oh, and yes, I also have this hobby project, nothing too serious, but it's global sport governance. It resonated with me. I thought, well, that's interesting. Nobody has really thoroughly researched that. And it kind of connected with maybe a broader interest in global governance and the role of the European Union and how powerful private actors can be held to account, these interests that I had. So, that was a natural way to start. And well, it just, I basically kept on going. After that, I did my thesis and I thought, well, now I think I need a little bit more background into EU law to really fully comprehend that. I did a master in EU law. And I had the opportunity to pursue a PhD, and I started working at a university, and here we are 15, 16 years later.
Well, you talked about the European Union. We know that the EU has positioned itself as a key promoter of, I quote, good governance in sport. From your perspective, what does the EU actually mean by good governance, and how clearly is that concept defined in practice?
The concept of good governance is rarely um, defined very specifically in practice, and the EU's definition is no exception. I don't know that definition by heart, but when I look at it, I see the typical broad principles and dimensions of good governance like transparency, democracy, accountability, big abstract concepts that most people and organizations tend to agree with, but disagreement starts when the precise mechanisms for implementing them are being discussed. So, in sum, when I look at the definition of good governance that the EU has proposed, I see the same broad principles and dimensions of good governance that are employed elsewhere in different conceptualizations and definitions. I think there's nothing wrong with that, but these are abstract, broad principles. They need to be translated into clear, specific functioning mechanisms of good governance. And this is where usually disagreement starts.
Recent cases like the International Skating Union and the European Super League ruling suggest that EU law can significantly shape good governance. Do these cases mark a turning point in the EU's role, and are they still exceptions rather than norms?
I don't think they provide a real turning point in the EU's approach towards sport, and more specifically, sport governing bodies like FIFA, UEFA, the IOC. I think there are basically two ways wherein the EU can control sport governing bodies, where they two ways in which the EU can hold these bodies to account. And the first one is what I call the legal route, the applications of general principles of EU law, most notably those related to the functioning of the internal market, so free movement law, competition law. The other route is what I have called the EU sports policy route, which means basically soft or hard regulation targeted at sport governing bodies. Now, whereas in the EU legal route, the EU's role is confined to telling sport governing bodies what they cannot do under EU law. Under the EU sports policy route, hypothetically, the EU could tell sport governing bodies what they must do. And I think that that second route holds the most promise for promoting principles of good governance. Now, in the cases that you cite are obvious examples of the application of legal principles, general legal principles. So it's the EU legal route. I don't think it's a major shift in which that legal route has been functioning in the past. It's an it's a continuation and maybe an incremental development of that route. So basically, what the EU has done in those cases, summarizing and simplifying significantly here, is saying, okay, sport governing bodies, it's okay for you to be both the regulator of sport and the organizer of a competition. It's okay for you to determine which actors can or cannot organize a competition, but you must do that by using objective criteria and actually, in a way, by applying principles of good governance, right? So it is significant, but I don't think it's a fundamental turning point.
But despite these interventions, we can see that many international federations remain largely self-regulated. So, what are the structural limits of the EU's influence when it comes to governing global sport? Because, as you were saying, in theory it sounds doable, but in practice we can see that it's still very far from what you say. Is there also a lack of willingness?
Yeah. Well, the structural limits are, I would say, mostly political limits. So that means that the political context currently is preventing the EU from developing um, a more significant policy route. So uh, the type of interventions that would tell sport governing bodies what they must do in relation to good governance. So more specifically, tell sport governing bodies which principles of good governance they should implement and how. That is something that is largely lacking for the moment. So I think there are two things that the EU could do. One is more soft regulation, like adopting more specific principles of a good governance, telling sport governing bodies, well, we expect you to implement these specific mechanisms, not broad general principles like accountability, democracy, transparency. I mean, sport governing bodies will basically say, yes, we agree that these broad principles are important and we are basically already implementing them. I think more significant for the EU would be to determine the exact mechanisms of good governance that they should implement. Again, through soft regulation, that would mean that implementation would remain voluntary, but that the EU would be much more specific about how sport governing bodies should implement principles of good governance. I think that could have an effect because most sport governing bodies want to maintain good relations with the EU because they do not want to jeopardize the application of fundamental principles of EU law, competition law, free movement law, to them. But of course, a more effective way would be hard regulation, whereby the EU will really adopt binding rules for that sport governing bodies like FIFA, like UEFA would have to adhere with. It is possible in practice. It can be done legally. Scholars like Stephen Wetherill have worked on that topic more recently. But the main barrier is a political one. The member states do not want to grant the EU a far-reaching role in sport, any grand role in sport. Sport is a very sensitive policy area connected to issues like culture. And they want to retain that authority, so they do not want to delegate too much authority to the EU. And on the other hand, we see that there is a lot of respect for the principle of the autonomy of sport, which kind of limits EU intervention ex ante. It means that there is kind of a political consensus that sport governing bodies need to be autonomous, need to be as autonomous as possible, and that they basically should self-regulate. So apart from general principles of EU law, I don't think that the EU wants to impose very specific rules targeted at sport governing bodies.
We're gonna come back at the concept of autonomy later, but before you mentioned the concept of free movement in sports. So to what extent is the EU genuinely improving the global standards? We saw the Bosman case, the Diarra case, as opposed to primarily regulating sport through competition and internal market law. How does the EU genuinely improve these governance standards in sport?
Well, again, it is, I think, mostly in an indirect way. It is through the legal route, which means telling sport governing bodies what they cannot do under EU law. And so by kind of making sure that there is adherence to principles like free movement, you ensure more general principles of freedom for athletes, which can be connected to good governance. Another way, I think, wherein the EU is promoting principles of good governance through free movement law, or by ensuring adherence to free movement law, is by whenever sport governing bodies establish rules limiting the freedom of movement, they are kind of required by the EU to consult with stakeholders, to consult with athletes, and that promotes the general principle of democracy. So, for instance, whenever FIFA comes up with a new football transfer system, they enter into a discussion with the European Commission, and the European Commission tells FIFA that, well, if you want to revise these rules, it is important for us that you consult with football players, with athletes, or with organizations that are representative of this group of your key constituents. And by applying that pressure on sport governing bodies, the EU is actually requiring sport governing bodies to be more democratic. So this whole legal route is kind of promoting good governance in a more indirect way, and would be the development of a sports policy route, whereby the EU would say, well, you need to implement these and these and these mechanisms, concrete mechanisms of good governance.
Arnout, you've worked extensively on governance measurement tools. Do EU-backed governance initiatives and benchmarks lead to real institutional change, or do they risk encouraging formal compliance without substantive accountability?
And what would be these initiatives promoted by the EU, like Erasmus Plus initiatives?
For example,
Well, somebody would have to look into that. I think it will be a very interesting research topic to take a look at. I think it can improve good governance, especially at the national level. So I wouldn't be too critical about that. But what we see is that these types of voluntary initiatives, they can improve good governance for those organizations that are willing to implement certain principles of good governance. So they provide information, they provide some best practices, they stimulate discussion about principles of good governance, which can also induce change. But again, most of that type of change is restricted to those organizations that were willing in the first place to implement principles of good governance. What is mainly lacking at the EU level is an approach for organizations that do not want to implement principles of good governance, or, to be more precise, more specific instruments of good governance. So those sport governing bodies operating at the national or the international level that, for instance, do not want to implement a fully independent ethics committee, sport governing bodies that do not want to implement strict term limits, sport governing bodies that do not wish to increase the accountability of their leadership. Those organizations do not see their incentive structures changed by anything that the EU is currently doing. So I think what the EU is currently doing, we should not be too critical of it, but I think there is a lot of room for improvement left.
Sports organizations often invoke autonomy, as you talked about earlier, to resist external interference. How has the EU challenged or reshaped this principle? And do you see autonomy evolving in response to EU pressure?
Well, I think we need to start with determining what the autonomy of sport actually means. And if we look at the discourse of sport governing bodies, it actually is very, very broad interpretation of their mandate to regulate sport. The key discursive promoter of the principle of good governance has been the International Olympic Committee, the IOC, right? What the IOC basically says is, well, we should be able to establish our own rules, our own internal functioning, and all of that, of course, within the limits of the law, right? And also, I think within the limit of us actually implementing good governance, right? So what they say is, as long as we implement good governance and respect general principles of EU law, you should leave us alone, right? And that actually sounds quite reasonable. If indeed sport governing bodies would effectively self-regulate through principles of good governance, there would be no need for external intervention. So it sounds reasonable. The problem is that sport governing bodies, like the IOC, at the same time are saying, we should determine what constitutes good governance. We should monitor good governance, and there should be no external enforcement of good governance. On that, very extensive self-regulation of good governance, like we determine what it means and whether or not we adhere to it. And if there are to be any consequences, it's for us to determine which those consequences are. Actually give sport governing bodies an enormously broad mandate, right? They're basically saying you can intervene if we do not adhere to principles of good governance, but we will decide whenever we apply principles, yes or no. So they basically are saying, we are determining whenever you can intervene. For any other sector outside of sport to say such a thing would be ridiculous. Imagine that the oil sector would say something like that, like, you cannot intervene in our affairs unless we do not adhere to principles of good governance, but we determine what principles of good governance are, and we determine whether or not we adhere to them, right? It will be ridiculed. But here we are, sport governing bodies can effectively do that, right? I think the EU has not really challenged that interpretation of the autonomy of sport. The EU is saying, well, in order to enjoy autonomy, you must implement principles of good governance, which is a little bit stricter, but it basically comes down to the same thing. It's still up to sport governing bodies to determine whether or not they adhere to principles of good governance. So, and I don't see a fundamental change in that approach. Maybe there will be another court case. There probably will, and that will then restrict the autonomy of sports governing bodies, because it will expand the number of principles that the EU determines that they must adhere to, but those are legal principles, and is not related in any direct sense to good governance.
But why do we have this exception with sports precisely? Because you said if it happened with other sectors, it would be ridiculous. Why in sports exactly?
Well, I think there are a number of reasons, but I think it's a very good question. I think there are a number of explanations, and perhaps not a single one that really can provide a definitive answer. But maybe let me focus on the most important one. I think this principle of autonomy of sport resonates well with a more broad principle of freedom of association, which is regarded as a very important and even constitutional principle in liberal democracies. And these are the kind of principles that liberal democratic institutions like the EU really, really like. Whereas government intervention in sport is mostly associated with more authoritarian regimes. That connected with the enormous lobbying power, the symbolic authority of institutions like the International Olympic Committee, and a bunch of other more minor, I think, reasons have resulted in the situation that we're at today, a situation wherein the United Nations General Assembly formally um, endorses the principle of the autonomy of sport. And again, it would be considered ridiculous if the United Nations General Assembly would do that for any other sector. But for sport, I mean, nobody's really complaining about it.
Okay, Arnout, now let's zoom out because we know sports becomes increasingly global. With growing influence from actors all over the world, from the Gulf, from Asia, and other regions, how does this affect the EU's ability to shape governance standards internationally?
Um, well, I still think that much of the EU's influence depends on the strength of its internal market for sport, and I think the EU market is still strong enough to kind of give the EU gravitas in the field of sports. Now, I do think that other political actors are perhaps a little less naive than the EU. At the EU level, we see principled adherence to autonomy, whereas other political actors are maybe formally adhering to that principle, but are behind the scenes doing everything they can to influence sport governance. So in that sense, I think we see a fundamental shift away from EU influence or European influence towards, more Middle Eastern influence in sports like football. And if the EU will and European leaders especially are to continue their naive approach, meaning their principled adherence to principles like autonomy, which basically give sport governing bodies a carte blanche for self-regulation. Well, then I think EU influence, the de facto EU influence that we have, European influence, will decline even further because other political actors are asserting themselves more firmly and are not as naive as European leaders are.
Looking ahead, do you see the EU remaining a central regulatory force in global sport governance, or is its influence likely to decline as the geopolitical center of sports continues to shift?
Well, as long as we have these cases from time to time, and as long as from time to time the rules and basically also the functioning of these sport governing bodies come under EU scrutiny, I think there is still scope for EU influence. And I think and I'm certainly not a legal expert, but having read many of the recent articles by legal scholars, we are far from seeing a decline in that sense. I think that the EU's legal role will continue to persist, and that is really the backbone of again the EU's gravitas as an actor that can achieve change in global sport governance.
Finally, since this is called the Sports Governance Podcast, I would like to end with a more conceptual question. Arnout, how would you define the term sports governance today?
Well, I mean, governance can relate to many things. Mostly, it refers to the institutional setting. So that means that the institutions through which sport is governed and how they are constituted and the influence that they have. It can also relate to more the power relations and actor constellations that exist in sport governance. And finally, it can relate to the concrete policies that are being enacted, right? So I would say sport governance constitutes, in a more precise sense, any one of those three sub-dimensions. So the institutional architecture, the power relations and actor constellations, and the specific policies that are being enacted. Anything that concerns those dimensions in relation to sport is basically sport governance. More broadly, I would say sport governance constitutes the patterns of organized rule or the patterns of ordered rule that that emerge from the governing activities of all the relevant actors in sport governance. And it's up to you as a student and to scholars of sport governance to determine which aspects are most worthy of our attention.
As we come to the end of this episode, what becomes clear is that the role of the EU in sports governance is both more significant and more limited than it often appears. Throughout this conversation, we have seen that the EU doesn't govern sport directly. It doesn't set the rules of the game in the same way as international federations. And yet, through law, through market regulation, and through judicial intervention, it has the capacity to reshape the boundaries within which sport operates. What emerges is a form of indirect governance, one that constrains rather than replaces the authority of sports governing bodies. At the same time, this influence remains structurally constrained, politically because member states are reluctant to give the EU a stronger mandate in sports, institutionally because much of sports still relies on self-regulation, and conceptually because principles like the autonomy of sports continue to limit external intervention, even when governance failures are evident. And this brings us back to a broader pattern we have explored across previous episodes. Whether we looked at enforcement, athlete protection, or governance in time of crisis, the same tension keeps reappearing. Sport operates through powerful private structures, but with limited external accountability. Governance exists, but it's often uneven. Enforcement exists, but it's selective. And accountability, more often than not, stops before it reaches the top. What the EU introduces into this landscape isn't a complete solution, but a point of friction, a legal and regulatory counterweight that in certain moments can challenge monopoly power, require transparency, and reopen questions that sports would otherwise keep internal. But whether this remains sufficient in the future is far from certain. As sports continues to globalize with new centers of power emerging beyond Europe, the EU's influence may become more contested. If other actors are less constrained by principles like autonomy and more willing to intervene strategically, then the balance of power in global sports governance may gradually shift. So the question moving forward is not simply whether the EU can regulate sports. It's whether it can remain a meaningful governance actor in a system that is becoming increasingly global, politically complex, and strategically contested. Because ultimately, sports governance is not just about rules or institutions. It's about who has the power to shape them, who has the power to challenge them. If you enjoyed this episode and want to help shape the next ones, let me know in the comments what topics you would like explored. Make sure to follow the podcast on streaming platforms and LinkedIn if you found this useful. You were listening to the Sports Governance Podcast by Jöns Fireri. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time.